Hello and welcome to the Patent Literacy Symposium and this session, SLD Identification Methods, Cognitive Tests versus Instructional Response. My name is Andrew Bell and I'm joined by my colleague Kim Jenkins. We are excited to facilitate this session for everyone. A few housekeeping items before this session starts. This session is 75 minutes long and it will be recorded. The chat feature will be off between participants, but you will be able to chat with us, the hosts, if you have any needs. Please keep your video feature off and mute yourself to eliminate any potential distractions to the presentation. The presenter, Dr. Jack Fletcher, will answer a few questions at the end of the session if there's time. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and I'll see those. We would love for you to tweet out or share on social media all you are learning from the symposium. The hashtag for the Patent Literacy Symposium is hashtag PALit Symposium 2020. And now I would like to introduce you to Dr. Jack Fletcher. He is a Hugh, Roy, and Lily Kranz-Cullen Distinguished University Professor of Psychology at the University of Houston, where he also serves as Associate Vice President for Research. For the past 35 years, Dr. Fletcher, a board-certified child neuropsychologist, has conducted research on children with learning and attention disorders and brain injury. Dr. Fletcher directs a Learning Disability Research Center grant and has directed program projects involving neurobiological factors and learning in spina bifida and math disabilities, all funded by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. He served on the NICHD National Advisory Council, the RAND Reading Study Group, the National Research Council Committee on Scientific Principles in Education Research, and the President's Commission on Excellence in Special Education. Dr. Fletcher was the recipient of the Samuel T. Orton Award from the International Dyslexia Association in 2003, and co-recipient of the Albert J. Harris Award from the International Reading Association of 2006. He is the past president of the International Neuropsychological Society. Welcome, Dr. Fletcher.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, especially since I get to sit here in my shorts and my red University of Houston t-shirt. I'm going to talk with you today about something that I think I understand very well, which is how to evaluate children for learning disabilities. I've done it my whole life. I'm trained as a neuropsychologist, and I consider myself a professional tester. And I think my best credential is that every week prior to the COVID-19 crisis, when we had to close down, I run an assessment clinic at the university where I teach second-year students how to give tests and work with kids that have school problems. It's not a school psychology or an educational program. These are clinical psychologists. And I try and help them understand that if they're going to deal with kids that are having behavior problems or things of that sort, they're not going to be effective unless they deal with the school dimension, and that often involves some form of assessment, but that the assessment itself ought to be brief, informative, and treatment-oriented, and that what they need to learn how to do is prescribe effective interventions for school problems, including things like ADHD, but also learning disability, and not simply expect to pawn that off to the school or to some other professional, that if somebody's going to come in and do an assessment, it's their job to talk about what effective intervention would be. I've spent a lot of time in my career studying identification methods for learning disabilities, and that's because when I started my career in the late 70s, I had to open a clinic. It was expected. And I was going to assess kids. I was a child neuropsychologist, so I expected to see kids with epilepsy and brain injury and things of that sort, which is something I'm very interested in. But pretty quickly, my clinic was filled with kids who couldn't read and wouldn't sit still. And so I would write these reports based on what I knew how to do. They were very long, about 12 pages, 11 and a half pages of 8 hours of tests that I had given, and a half a page of recommendations like put the kid in special education. This was right after Public Law 94, 142, or do behavior modification. And I would get calls from parents that said that school wouldn't accept um, my report because I didn't give the right tests. I wasn't giving comprehensive achievement batteries, and I didn't, since I gave all the neuropsychological tests, I wasn't really giving a full IQ test. So I thought that was really interesting. I started going to what in Texas are called admission review and dismissal meetings, you know, the interdisciplinary team meetings. And it was really very interesting. The school was very nice and let me give my report. They managed to stay awake, and then the diagnostician would give the really important information, which was the kid's IQ test and their achievement test score. And if there was a 16-point difference, the child was eligible for special education. If not, the child was not eligible, at which point the educational diagnostician stopped talking, and the educators started developing the treatment plan, the IEP. Test data wasn't used. I thought that was really very interesting. I started studying it. I had the ability to construct studies and get data on kids that had IQ and achievement tests. I expanded that into other kinds of methods, decided that it wasn't really interesting to just say what was wrong with identification, that I needed to come up with alternatives to it. And in particular, I needed to work on the problem of what to do about it. So I started working with reading educators like Louisa Moats and Barbara Foreman, and my long-term colleague, Sharon Vaughn, who know a lot more about reading than I do. But my role in all these studies has been to deal with the disability component and to deal with the assessment component. And so what I'm going to talk to you about, before I start talking, I want to point out that we have a web center. We do tweet. And if you'd like to be our friend on Facebook, we put out all kinds of materials on reading and on learning disabilities. And we have 25 modules for parents on how to work with kids on different skills at home, like how to teach vocabulary or letter sound awareness and things of that sort, that are in 10-minute episodes and are parent oriented, put together by our education team. I have disclosures here which you can look at. If you're really interested in the assessment, you should look at our book, which is actually in the second edition, 2019. I should update this slide. But it has a chapter on assessment, and I'd encourage you to buy it because I make 25 to 50 cents every time somebody buys one. Not aligned with standards. I'm the father to, I should take that question mark off because they really are grown and independent now, just in the last couple of years. And the research is supported by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, which supports the Texas Center for Learning Disabilities. Today, what I want to emphasize, I know a lot of you use discrepancy models, lots of schools do. I am not saying that you're bad or doing things wrong. I simply want you to understand the strengths and weaknesses of the methods that you're understanding, because there is research about these methods, and they do have strengths and weaknesses, and no single method is perfect. And I'm going to be critical of every method that is in place. But at the end, I'm going to provide for you a simple view of what we should be doing to assess kids for learning disabilities. It's much simpler than what we typically do. One big motive that I have for doing that is to reduce the emphasis on testing so that we have more resources for teaching. We spend way too much money trying to find the right kid and not nearly enough money trying to teach them. And we can give assessments that allow us to identify kids who need assistance that are much quicker, more parsimonious, less expensive, and let us make more accurate decisions about the types of intervention programs that kids should write. So we're going to understand the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches for comprehensive assessments for special education eligibility, the importance of assessing in relation to instruction, and then how to do comprehensive evaluations for specific learning disabilities in the context of a multiple tiers of support system. But first, the problem is that we have no consensus about identification and the relation of comprehensive evaluation and instruction. And I'm going to show you some survey data that demonstrates this. This is from a survey done by the National Center for Learning Disabilities of 64 school systems. They're not necessarily just districts. And so they asked these districts, the special education, I'm not quite sure who they asked, but at any rate, how strongly do you support the discrepancy model for identifying specific learning disabilities? And you can see there's a lot of controversy. A 5 means strong support, a 1 means little support. So here we have 48% of people saying they don't support it very much. And we have 38% saying that they do support it quite a bit. If you look at the second slide, whoops, which says, how strongly do you agree with this following statement? A specific learning disability is a learning challenge that is evidenced by both low achievement and a deficit in one or more cognitive processes which result in that debate. By the way, I agree with that statement. I believe that learning disabilities are caused by cognitive problems. I don't believe that you have to assess them. And again, you can see that the majority agree with that statement. It's about 54%, but about 30% or so don't agree with that statement. They don't think, and the people that disagree with it are basically saying that they don't think the problem is intrinsic within the child. How strongly do you support RTI as a model for identifying SLD? Well, you can see that there's a lot of support for this, but if you ask the same question to the same people, which is how strongly do you support patterns of strengths and weaknesses as a model for identifying SLD, and I'll define what this means a little bit later, you can see that that also gets a lot of support. So both these models have a lot of support, and what lots of districts are doing, unfortunately, is using both RTI and once a kid goes to special education, they use some sort of discrepancy model. And then there's this statement, which is, do you believe that cognitive assessments are necessary to determine whether or not a student has an SLD? It doesn't necessarily involve IQ, but it does involve a cognitive assessment. And you can see that 86% of the respondents believe that you should give cognitive tests to children that have a learning disability. It is a harmless practice. And again, I'm not criticizing people who do it. I'm simply pointing out that there's little evidence that supports it, and that it's costly and doesn't help with treatment. But the decision is yours. So why do assessments? I want to distinguish the point of an assessment as an eligibility assessment, where you have school psychologists who just give tests and then sit in the corner and are quiet. Not necessarily, but that's often what happens, versus differentiated instruction. The idea that we could use comprehensive evaluations to actually plan an intervention in the IEP. So a lot of school-based assessment is oriented to eligibility, but effective assessments also lead to enhanced instruction, and in particular address the question of whether the student is responding to instruction, which I think is the most important question that we ask in special education. What differentiation means is identifying strengths and weaknesses in a student's academic proficiency, the concepts that they know and the concepts that they don't know, and then tailor instruction towards what they don't know. It is absolutely a deficit-oriented method, because we have to help kids catch up in what they don't know. It begins in the core classroom through screening and progress monitoring, And it becomes much more intensive and more individualized. Personalized is probably a better term, depending on the severity of the problem and the student's response to instruction. That is an MTSS method. But no method in school, no matter what your approach to service delivery is, whether it's MTSS or not, you need data. You need to know who is at risk. You need to be able to identify the strengths and weaknesses, the skills the student has mastered and the skills that are still developing. You need to know how well your instructional programs are working for the individual child and for the school as a whole. And you need to know how to move students through increasingly intense interventions and minimize the use of resources, because we don't have the resources that we need to take care of all the students that have needs. So in order to understand assessments, you have to understand learning disabilities and what they are. And your understanding will depend on the conceptual model that you use. The key definitional criteria, I refer to these as the attributes of a learning disability, the attributes of a classification that tells us who meets criteria for a learning disability and who doesn't. There are three of them. One is absolute low achievement. Kids need to be behind other kids in learning to read, write, or do math. It needs to be unexpected, meaning that the kid ought to be able to learn, because most kids do learn to read, write, and do math, and there has to be a reason that it's unexpected. And that's where different models of learning disabilities vary. And then it has to be not attributable to another contraindicative condition, the best example of which is an intellectual disability. But typically, we don't, even though kids with autism, for example, have reading and writing problems, we don't refer to that as a learning disability. We exclude things like motivation problems or economic disadvantage or things of that sort. But then you get into a chicken and egg kind of question, or emotional disturbance, because it's not clear whether it's the learning disability that causes the emotional behavioral problem or vice versa. And many kids present with both kinds of problems. And it's better to think about these as either being another disorder that contraindicates or contributes to the learning disability, but regardless needs intervention. This is all complicated because there is no gold standard for learning disability. And when we talk about attention deficit disorder, for example, there is a gold standard. There is a broad consensus about what constitutes attention deficit disorder. People agree that the criteria that are in the DSM are accurate. They are empirically validated. People use them, and it's a real boon for intervention and for research. But as I said in my keynote, it's very important to understand that learning disabilities are a dimensional disorder, that they are normally distributed in the population, and that kids vary in severity on the attributes that determine a learning disability, like low achievement or instructional response or something like that. We are forced to make a categorical decision, but it's not a categorical disorder. The attributes of learning disabilities are real. You should not take from this talk that I don't believe in learning disabilities. I can actually prove that they are real entities, but they are latent constructs. And we only know them. What that means is that we only know them through the way that we measure them. And so how we choose to measure them has a lot to do with how we understand a learning disability. And if you want to understand what I mean by a latent construct, just think about IQ. IQ is not something that you see. It's not something that you wear branded on your head. Kids don't go around with 103 above their forehead. You only know what a person's IQ is by how you measure it. And that's important because when we measure it, all tests have measurement error. An IQ test is highly reliable, but it has a small amount of measurement error. So if we try and repeat the measure, and we do it over a period of time, it could be weeks, it could be months, it could be with different tests, there will be measurement error. But fortunately, the tests are very reliable. And so the degree of measurement error and the extent to which it influences our estimate of the child's true level of intention of intelligence will fall within a confidence interval that's defined by the confidence interval. So the best way to understand that is to think about how we identify intellectual disabilities. We don't have a firm threshold. We don't say it's 2 standard deviations below the mean, it's 70. We say we do use that as a threshold, but then we apply the measurement error, which for a 95% confidence interval is 2 standard errors of measurement, or 2.5 points on either side. And so when we identify an intellectual disability, we talk about IQ as a range of 65 to 75. And then because it's a 3-pronged diagnosis, there has to be evidence of adaptive impairment, which we assess through interviews, and the age of onset is 18. We apply those and we make a clinically informed decision about whether the child has an intellectual disability. We don't do that with learning disabilities. What we have done historically is to set a firm threshold, say that if you're below this threshold, if you have a discrepancy between IQ and achievement to 16 points, you're eligible. If not, you're not eligible. Or we take a method like PSW, pattern of strengths and weaknesses, and we say you either meet criteria or you don't meet criteria. None of these methods takes into account measurement error, and it leads to inherent unreliability in the identification of a child as at the threshold or below the threshold, and I'll show you that in a little bit. But what this means is that all approaches that are purely psychometric approaches to learning disabilities identification are unreliable at the level of the individual, including methods that are based on RTI. And I'll show you that in a little bit. The message here, and the message of IDEA 2004, IDEA 2004 was a very deliberate intent to move identification away from formulas, to move districts away from strict formulas that were based on IQ achievement discrepancy towards methods that were more flexible, and to make a clinically informed, team-based decision about whether the child was eligible and would benefit from special education services. It's a 2-pronged decision. There has to be evidence for disability. There has to be evidence that the disability causes adaptive impairment. There's educational need. But IDEA redefined a comprehensive evaluation as a comprehensive data gathering process. And if you read it carefully, it's clear that it may or may not involve standardized tests. I do not think that you should identify kids for a learning disability without the use of some standardized tests, but I think they're overemphasized and they detract from the team-based decision-making and the determination of the educational intervention. So the message is not that the methods that you're using are wrong, it's how you're using them that may be getting you into trouble. So this is the same diagram that I showed you early that simply demonstrates the dimensionality of the attributes of a learning disability. And this is true for low achievement. It's also true for instructional response. And if you take a threshold, for example, you decide that you're going to work with the bottom 13.6% of the population here, which is about a standard deviation and a half here. The issue is how to reliably identify a child here at this, at the bottom, this is actually the bottom 16%, 1 standard deviation. How do you identify a child reliably as being below this threshold? Well, we have research that shows that if you have a test that has a reliability that's very high, you would actually have to assess a child 4 times and get 4 scores that are below this threshold in order to identify the child as having a true score that's below this threshold. That's what? Multiple hours of assessment. The alternative, of course, is to put a confidence interval around here and to identify kids who fall into the confidence interval, which is much more reliable. So let's talk about conceptual frameworks, because that's what drives our selection of assessments. The oldest conceptual framework, and the one that drove our understanding of specific learning disabilities since they were initially described in the modern era around the turn of the previous century, is a neurological model. The idea that a learning disability is a disorder of constitutional origin. Now, learning disabilities are absolutely brain-based, but saying that they're a disorder of constitutional origin does not deal with the malleability of the constitutional processes. The fact that the brain is plastic, that in order to learn to read or do math or write, the brain has to reorganize to support it. This method has its roots in phrenology, which is a science that measured different parts of the skull, where it was presumed that the indentations told you about different attributes of the person. The goal of a neurological model is to identify defective areas of the brain. The measurement approach is to identify special signs of neurological dysfunction. So we might do a neurological examination to look for signs of finger agnosia or right-left confusion. Those are very prominent theories of a learning disability in the 60s and the 70s for perceptual motor problems, for things like that. It led to the idea of minimal brain dysfunction. I'm probably one of the only people old enough to remember when that was a popular and actually used term. It was used up until about 1980 when DSM-3 came out and dropped it. But it's largely been discredited, even though you will still see manifestations of the special sign approach in approaches that involve things like exercise or brain training or optometric exercises, approaches that have been shown to lack scientific merit. You have to be able to see in order to read, but there's a recent randomized trial, for example, that shows that optometric exercises are ineffective at helping children with reading interventions. And if you email me, I'll send it to you. This is a cartoon that you'll all recognize, where Lucy is reading a scholarly journal. It's probably Ladies' Home Journal or Reader's Digest or the Men's Muscle Quarterly, something like that. It says, indications of a possible learning disability, has a slow recall of facts, makes spelling errors, has an unstable grip. It's a method that is based on understanding the signs of a learning disability, where you identify static, and I emphasize the word static because learning disabilities are not static. Children change. They are dynamic, and you have to have a dynamic recursive approach to understanding learning disabilities. Neurobiological disorder, in order to intervene, you have to figure out whether it's the parietal lobe that's involved, and if it's the parietal lobe, you train parietal lobe functions. It doesn't work, and that's why it's not used any longer. Then we have cognitive discrepancy methods, where low achievement is unexpected because of normal intelligence or the presence of cognitive strengths. And there are two prominent approaches. The earlier one is IQ achievement discrepancy, which was initially adopted in the IDEA regulations in 1977 after Public Law 94-142 was passed, where learning disability was defined in the regulations as a discrepancy between IQ and achievement that was done despite very little evidence that actually supported the validity of that hypothesis. That hypothesis, as a classification hypothesis, has been widely discredited. And instead, what people are now proposing are called processing strengths and weaknesses methods, or PSW methods. Discrepancy methods have a long history in the field of LD. They are instantiated in the way that we think about learning disabilities, but they're no longer required in special education after IDEA 2004. And I'll talk more about both types of methods in a little bit. And then we have an instructional framework, which people refer to as RTI. I like to distinguish MTSS, which is a service delivery system, from RTI, where RTI, response to intervention, is a byproduct of the MTSS system, but it is how you would go about identifying children for a learning disability. It would incorporate assessments of instructional response, and would involve things like progress monitoring growth, where you have a goal line here, and you have different probe assessments, and you look at the child's progress relative to this chart. In this method, learning disability identification is based on the direct assessment of basic academic processes. It is not a method that is based solely on the basis of instructional response. That would be illegal. IDEA requires a comprehensive evaluation that has multiple things that have to be done, including child observation and things of that sort, but it explicitly incorporates low achievement and instructional response criteria. This is the language from the statute, IDEA 2004. It talks about two methods for identifying children as eligible in the learning disability category. It says the child does not make sufficient progress to meet age or state approved grade level standards in one or more of the 8 domains of achievement. I didn't spell them out. When using a process based on the child's response to scientific research-based intervention. And then it has this little word here that I put in red, which is called or. Now, if you have dyslexia, you may not recognize that that's or. You may think it says and or something like that, because context and the use of the semicolon here suggests that you ought to predict that and would occur. So if you guess, you might guess that and is going to occur, but in fact it's or. It's one or the other. You don't do both. And the district is supposed to decide what method they choose. The or is the child exhibits a pattern of strengths and weaknesses in performance. The grades, they're uneven in reading and math. Achievement, you can do that by grade. You can look at standardized tests or both. It can be relative to age, which is a simple low achievement definition. State approved grade level standards, because Congress was upset when parents were writing in and saying that their child failed the state accountability assessment 3 times in a row, and the school would not assess the kid for a learning disability. Or IQ, it continues to permit an IQ achievement discrepancy that is determined by the group to be relevant to the identification of a specific learning disability. What determines the assessment that you do is the interdisciplinary team. The state can write rules in the rulemaking process that permit or don't permit certain types of approaches, and 13 states, for example, have written rules that only allow RTI. But there are other states like Texas that allow what I would say is virtually any method that a district chooses to implement. But in fact, the IEP team, the interdisciplinary team, can decide what kinds of assessments, what kinds of results they need in order to make a determination of eligibility. There was a summit done by the Office of Special Education Programs in 2002 that talked about the most relevant criteria for identifying students with a learning disability. And this group identified 3 different criteria. They said that you should establish low achievement, that there ought to be some threshold under which children perform in reading, math, and writing that would determine that. Then it said you should evaluate instructional response and ask the question, is achievement unexpected? And then it said that you should apply what are called the exclusionary criteria, which means that you demonstrate that it's not due to another contraindicative condition, disorder, contextual condition, and so on. And you can still find this at this website right here. The importance here is that low achievement here is necessary, but it's not sufficient to identify somebody with a learning disability. So what's the validity of this hypothetical classification? Well, before that, here's the difference in sort of the traditional models and the models that are, these slides are out of order, and I apologize for that. In a traditional model, pre-IDEA 2004. Somebody would refer a kid, usually a teacher. Teacher would raise her hand and say, test this kid, there's something wrong with them. The kid would get eligibility testing here. You would be either eligible or you would not be eligible. If you're eligible, you get a treatment. The treatment is the IEP. Some kids respond to that treatment, some kids don't respond. How often do you know whether the child is responding or not responding to the IEP? Is it every 3 years when you repeat the evaluation to see if the child is still eligible? Is it every year when you reformulate the IEP goals? What about these kids right here? What do we do with them if they're not eligible? They simply go back to the regular classroom. People are worried about them. They're not achieving, but they're not learning disabled. What do we do for those kids? Think about that. Are they just slow learners? You know, we should have low expectations for them. And an RTI, a method based on MTSS, everybody gets screened. Your progress is monitoring. If you struggle, you immediately get intervention that starts in the general classroom, which is treatment 1, or might involve supplemental intervention, which is treatment 2. Some people respond, they continue to get monitored because everybody in the school that's at risk is monitored, and once at risk, you remain at risk. You don't respond adequately. If that persists and you think a child might need the protection of IDEA, you would go in and you would do some sort of eligibility testing. Some kids will be eligible, some kids will not be eligible. If you're not eligible, it's because you've asked the question, why is the child not responding to instruction? And you come up with an answer that does not involve eligibility for special education. It could be oral language proficiency, it could be a different disorder, it could be the fact that the child hasn't been showing up for school. Lots of different reasons, but you know why, and you can develop an intervention plan for that. Then you get a different intervention, which is, you know, tier 3 or an IEP or something like that. I know that in some schools, tier 3 is done in general education. In some schools, it is special education. It's whatever model you decide to adopt, as long as you implement it with fidelity. Some kids respond, some kids don't respond, but we know that because we are monitoring frequently, and we're looking at our data every 10 weeks or so to see if the kid is not responding, and we modify the IEP depending on whether we're getting some evidence of instructional response. That's special education. That makes it special. So let me talk about the validity of some of these frameworks. Let's talk about the validity of cognitive discrepancy frameworks. And I'm giving you a warning that I don't believe that these are evidence-based methods. But I'm also not criticizing you because you choose to do one of these. I just encourage you to understand the strengths and weaknesses of it. This is an IQ achievement discrepancy framework. In this framework, there is an achievement weakness, reading, math, or writing. You give the child an IQ test. The child either has a discrepancy with IQ and they're learning disabled, or they have no IQ achievement discrepancy and they're not low achievement. They simply are low, they're not learning disabled, they're simply low achievers. To understand the validity question, the question that you have to ask is, what are the differences between kids who are in this block and kids who are in this block? And the differences certainly don't involve achievement tests or IQ tests, because that's how you define them. They have to involve something different, like other tests of cognitive processes, other methods like neurobiological methods, intervention response, and things like that. So this has been studied extensively. And so what we know is that if we look for differences in kids that are IQ discrepant and non-IQ discrepant low achievers, they differ, by the way, in IQ, depending on the method, by full standard deviation, about 15 points. They do not differ significantly in behavior, in achievement, cognitive skills, particularly those that are closely related to learning to read or learning to do math. They do not differ in intervention response, and they don't differ in brain function once you take into account definitional variability. We know that IQ itself does not predict intervention response. In the best intervention study that I've ever done, I showed it in my keynote study. It was that early intervention study led by Patricia Mathis and Carolyn Denton. The IQ score of the responders ranged from 64 to 118. I realize that's not intuitive, that certainly you would think that IQ would predict response to reading comprehension, for example. And it's not the same as saying that they're not correlated, because IQ and achievement are, correlate on average about 0.6. That's not the same as saying that they account for unique growth in intervention response. We have people that have done brain imaging studies of these two groups. We don't find differences in brain activation profiles if you use IQ discrepancy or you simply compare kids with high IQ or low IQ. And that's because they don't differ in achievement. It's achievement that describes this. And then we know that any kind of status model that's based on identification may not be reliable if it's based on a single assessment or a cut point, because of the difficulties that I talked before about assessing kids around a set cut point. So if you're using a set cut point and you're using it as a formula, your ability to identify kids reliably around a particular discrepancy is weak. You simply won't make the right decisions, and you'll find a lot of flip-flopping of kids if you do that over time. So you really need to move away from formula-based kinds of discrepancies. The federal regulatory definition of learning disabilities, which was adopted in 1977, was not aligned with research. It talked about a severe discrepancy between achievement and intellectual abilities in one or more of the following areas, and it describes all these different kinds of areas and leads to a particular type of assessment. And then it describes the third part, which are the exclusionary conditions here, which, by the way, did not come from research either. They were put in because Congress was concerned about double dipping. They were concerned about identifying kids in more than one eligibility category and counting it twice. And they were also concerned about kids identified for Title I eligibility. You have to remember that all of this came from the civil rights movement in the 60s, including concerns about kids with disabilities. And so these were put in to deal with coverage of kids who are economically disadvantaged through Title I. It doesn't mean that you can't identify Title I kid as learning disabled. It simply is intended to differentiate these categories. Now, I'm not saying that learning disabilities are not real. It stands up across different kinds of definitional variability, because I can take the same approach that I just showed you for IQ achievement discrepancy and show you that children and adults with different forms of learning disabilities can be differentiated from each other, from typical achievers, from kids with other disabilities based on cognitive correlates, intervention response, and neural correlates. And this simply shows differences in cognitive skills in kids that have dyslexia or reading disability, which is this group here, kids that have math disabilities, which is this group here, and kids who are typically achieving, which is this group here. And so if you have a math disability, and what's interesting about these groups is that these kids are purely dyslexic. They do not have ADHD. They don't have math disabilities, and so on. And so what you see in these kids is a strength in procedural learning. This is basically looking at visual displays and developing a plan for doing problem solving. And so if you know much about dyslexia, you know that historically kids with dyslexia have been able to learn to do things that they can see. They learn to be used to learn to be very effective car mechanics, for example, because they can watch that. They often have strengths in procedural learning. They have terrible difficulties with phonological awareness. And then there are a lot of skills that just generically discriminate kids with learning disabilities from kids who don't have learning disabilities. These are math disabled kids. Their weaknesses here in this particular study is in concept formation here, but you don't have that big marker that you have with phonological awareness. What's important is that these kids differ in not only differ in the shape, they have entirely different cognitive profiles. Now, I could do the same thing with a brain imaging study. I could put you into a magnet. I could ask you to read, and these kids would show underactivation of areas in the dorsal and ventral pathways that I showed you in my keynote here. These kids would not, on a reading task, show underactivation in these areas. They would show there would be some overlap, but they would show underactivation in different areas, like the intraparietal sulcus, for example, just to put a name to it, compared to these kids, or these kids here. The best example is intervention response. If I take these kids right here and I give them a math intervention, will their reading skills improve? No. And I actually know this because a study done by Robin Morris and his colleagues, where they did a intervention of kids who were struggling readers, and the control group involved math instruction, and they gave the kids math instruction, and they didn't improve in their reading. So this is the best example that I know of the validity of a classification. I can show a relationship between group membership and intervention outcome. If you have a reading problem, you need reading interventions. It may seem trivial, but we need to get to the point where we can take a profile where we know that a child has word reading difficulties and prescribe the intervention. That is what we do with ADHD. If a child meets criteria for ADHD, we know immediately what the evidence-based interventions are that we do. We consider medication intervention, make a decision about that. We consider different kinds of environmental interventions that might involve parent-based training, school programs, things of that sort. And then we consider the comorbidities because they influence our intervention. We don't do that with learning disabilities, but we can. We can absolutely do it. This is what happens if you take the reading disabled groups. I've added kids with comorbidity here, and I compare kids that have IQ achievement discrepancy, which are here, and kids that are simply low achievement in reading. The difference in IQ is the difference between 0 and 1. That's a standard deviation. The difference in these other cognitive skills here, which robustly discriminated kids with dyslexia from the other kids, is 3/10 of a standard deviation, which is this difference on average. But notice, these are the low achievers here. There's actually no difference in phonological awareness or rapid naming, which is the two key correlates, cognitive correlates of dyslexia, and there's no difference in intervention response in these groups. I showed you this slide in my keynote, and the point is to simply demonstrate that there's no difference in long-term development in kids that are IQ discrepant and kids that are not. Those are those two lines here. And so it's hard to show validity for the classification. One thing I would emphasize is that if you're identified as reading disabled or learning disabled using a discrepancy model, that child does meet eligibility criteria, meaning that that child likely has a disability. If you do it once, it may be unreliable, but at least the child has it. The problem is that the classification is not valid, and you're artificially restricting the classification because you can't discriminate these two groups. So some of my colleagues say that because of this, the dyslexia label is useless. My approach is to simply define dyslexia as a word level reading disability that affects word reading and spelling, and include all these kids as dyslexic. It does not, or as having word level reading disabilities. I do not know how to pull a dyslexic group out of this group. Nobody does. And so if you use IQ tests and you say only kids that are IQ discrepant are dyslexic, it's basically discriminatory. The alternative views are called the third method, where you evaluate strengths and weaknesses in cognitive processes for inadequate responders to determine the best treatment. It's based on an aptitude by treatment interaction framework, ATI, where you identify learning weaknesses, you tailor the intervention to the learning weakness, and that should be more effective. It's been studied for years. Multiple research-based, I have this in parentheses, methods based on cognitive achievement batteries. They have names like the cross-battery assessment method, the concordance-discordance method, the discrepancy consistency method. There was a survey done by Oregon that described these as research-based methods that were interchangeable and recommended for Oregon schools. And then a survey of learning disability professionals in 2010 that said that PSW methods are needed not just for diagnosis, but also for treatment, and that they're mandated by the statute. And so they work this way. You have an achievement weakness. Not all of them require achievement weakness, but they should, and so I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. You do processing tests, the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive battery, or the differential aptitude battery, or something like that. You need to have a processing strength here and a processing weakness. There has to be a relationship between the achievement weakness and the processing weakness. If you have no processing strength or weakness, you're not learning disabled. You're a slow learner. If you have a processing weakness and a processing strength, you're learning disabled. The reason they have to be linked is that you might have, for example, a reading decoding problem here. It has to be linked to a processing weakness, which would be phonological awareness or rapid naming. And then you need to have a strength like visual spatial reasoning, like the procedural learning that I talked about earlier. The question is whether there are differences in kids who are in this box versus this box. So proponents of cognitive tests and the need to do cognitive testing or PSW methods have a set of arguments. They say that statutes defining learning disabilities and legislation mandate cognitive assessments, that cognitive assessments are correlated with achievement domains. I'm going to deal with that one immediately and say, of course they are. Phonological awareness is absolutely related to decoding. Attentional skills are related to math. Fine motor skills are related to writing. Some of these correlations are strong. There's no question but that learning disabilities are cognitive disorders. But it doesn't mean that they have to be assessed for identification. That patterns of cognitive strengths or weaknesses discriminate learning disabled from non-learning disabled slow learners. That cognitive tests permit better treatment planning and intervention outcomes, and that clinicians using cognitive tests to make more informed decisions, use cognitive tests to make more informed decisions. All of these are not supported. This is the federal statute. I showed you the regulatory definition of learning disabilities in my keynote. The current one, I showed you the 1977 regulatory definition. But Congress passes a statutory definition that the Department of Education has to encode into regulations that states then write rules for. And this is a regulatory definition of learning disabilities. It's been around since learning disabilities were first recognized as a disability in 1968, even prior to Public Law 94-142. And it is a regulatory definition now in IDEA. A lot of people wonder why it's not open. The reason is that if you open the statutory definition, There are a lot of people that would want to eliminate learning disabilities from the special education legislation, so nobody touches this. But it's not very meaningful. It simply says that the term specific learning disability means a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes. This is psychological processes or cognitive processes, and this is why proponents of PSW methods say that you have to assess these. But read the rest of the definition. Involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, which may manifest itself as an imperfect ability to listen, speak, read, and write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. What IDEA says is that you have to measure the manifestations. It never says that you have to measure basic psychological processes. And in the guidance from the Department of Education, when the 2004 reauthorization was passed, after the regulations were read and public comment was produced, lots of people complained that an assessment of cognitive processes were not mandated. The department responded by saying that it does not believe that an assessment of psychological or cognitive processing should be required in determining whether a child has an SLD. There is no current evidence that such assessments are necessary or sufficient for identifying SLD. In many cases, these assessments have been used to make inappropriate intervention decisions. Still no support. So there is, in fact, no real evidence base other than the ones that have been demonstrated by a few small groups like my own that have looked at the validity of PSW methods. We did it initially by doing simulations. And we simulated what would happen if you use a PSW method. IQ discrepancy, for example, has also been simulated. And what you do when you do simulations is you create data sets where learning disability status of the child is known at a latent level. You just create distributions of data and you set cut points. And we ask how well the 3 PSW methods could recover these latent identifications. So you then take the simulated data and you feed it into the algorithms that these programs use. It's based on the idea that cognitive assessment should only be done after tier 2, not after tier 1, so that you wouldn't do it routinely. You would only do it with kids who fail tier 2 intervention. What we found is that for all 3 methods, I showed you the methods earlier, the cross battery method, the discrepancy, the discordance, concordance method, and so on, the number of children identified as LD was very low. It was about 2 to 3%, depending on the size of the discrepancy that we adopted. Now that immediately should give you pause, because we're talking about kids after tier 2, where I am sure that half of kids with learning disabilities have persistent problems and will be inadequate responders after tier 2, and we're only able to recover 2 to 3%. But here's the real problem. For not LD, if we decide that a child does not have a learning disability, the methods are highly accurate. If you say no learning disabilities, that's right. That means high specificity and very few false negative errors. However, if the decision is that a child has a learning disability, there are many false positives. In other words, I say a kid has a learning disability, it is likely the child does not have a learning disability. So if I did 10,000 assessments, this is simulated data, and I used a consistency discrepancy method, I would identify 1,558 as learning disabled, 8,436 is not learning disabled. 25 decisions would be correct, so 1,533 are false positives and get the wrong treatment. You see the same thing with these other methods. For example, the cross battery method would identify 678 with a learning disability, 9,322 not learning disabled. Those decisions are largely correct. Of the 678, 353 would be correct, 325 are false positives, and they would get the wrong treatment. That's been supported by empirical studies using the Woodcock-Johnson normative samples of cognitive and achievement batteries and the cross-battery computer assessment with 900 kids. They found that the methods identified very few kids as learning disabled, about 2%. Again, that it was very accurate for not LD assessments, but very inaccurate for yes LD assessments. The false positive rate is 79%. And they concluded that the results of this study do not support the use of methods for identifying specific learning disabilities. We have done a whole series of studies, I'm not going to review them all, that look at the validity of PSW methods for LD identification in relation to instruction. In this particular study, we identify students as LD or not LD by two different methods, the consistency discrepancy method and the cross battery method. We gave kids an intensive intervention in reading, and we evaluated post-test performance, and we questioned whether identifying kids as LD or not LD, whether status made a difference in predicting intervention response, or whether cognitive tests themselves added value to the baseline assessments of reading and spelling in these reading interventions. So this is the outcome. This is a post-test measure. The question is how much variability is explained in passage comprehension at post-test for the two different methods, the consistent discrepancy method here or the cross-battery method. And what we've done in the two slides is we have outlined how much of the variability is explained by the pre-test measures of reading, how much is error, and the color that you see in red is the amount of variability that's explained by the PSW method. I know you don't see much red, and that's because there isn't very much. To make this even, there isn't very much red. It does not account for much variability. It basically isn't predictive. So to summarize the research, different PSW methods identify different kids as LD and not LD. They don't overlap, and they're not reliable in identifying PSW profiles. I didn't show you that research, but that's another set of papers that we have. Generally, PSW methods identify few students. There are lots of testing for every single student. PSW status does not predict differential treatment response. It does not correlate with meaningful outcomes. There's little evidence for differentiation of instruction. So where is the evidence that cognitive assessments are necessary for the identification of learning disabilities? I had an exchange arguing against the use of cognitive tests with Joel Snyder and Alan Kaufman, who argued for the use of cognitive tests. They agreed with our position. They agreed that there was not an evidence base that supported the use of cognitive tests for identification. They pointed out that most of the evidence was people who support PSW methods citing one another, and they argued that what we should do is not throw out the baby with the bathwater and continue to do research. I agree with that. I agree with the use of cognitive tests for young children when we use precursor methods, but I don't think the evidence supports this as a method. And I would especially draw your attention to research on the direct treatment of cognitive processes, where there's little evidence of aptitude by treatment interactions. For example, if you look at brain training games or cognitive training games that try and train working memory or executive functions independent of academic content, they do not generalize to the academic area. In the Melby, Lurbag, and Hume study, they found an effect size for the effects on working memory intervention using working memory tests of a half a standard deviation, but the effect on math skills was 0.07, which is trivial. Parker and Jacobson did not find generalization from executive function training studies. If you do neuroimaging studies and you image an executive function task, you do not find differences in kids with and without reading disabilities on the executive function task, but you do find differences between kids with and without reading disabilities on a reading comprehension tasks, but it activates the areas that are associated with working memory and cognitive control, and that predicts the degree of intervention. But the tests that we use are not useful for that. So what should we do instead? I talk about this as a hybrid method. It is not hard to implement. It goes back to the LD Summit. It involves a hybrid method. It uses what we've found to be valuable in terms of identification of where there's validity evidence, which is to establish low achievement, to evaluate instructional response, and to apply the exclusions. It consists of these three boxes, and what we would do is we would give norm reference achievement tests. I think that they are very useful for the identification of kids with learning disabilities, partly because I don't think there's evidence that supports the idea that a single achievement criterion is sufficient. So that if the only data you have is data from progress monitoring assessment, I don't think that data is sufficiently reliable for identification of individual cases. You need at least two criteria for accuracy. So I would give measures of low achievement, which are norm reference tests here. I would use assessments of instructional response, which are required by IDEA. But even if you're in a district that does not have an MTSS model, and you don't do universal screening, progress monitoring, and so on, you can still assess instructional response by looking at the child's level of achievement and evaluating by history what types of interventions the child has had and whether they've been effective enough in terms of what the child's level of achievement is. And then you have to consider the exclusionary and contextual factors, which may involve additional assessments. If a child, for example, has an intellectual disability, while I wouldn't do an IQ assessment if I thought the child had low achievement, had a learning disability, and I would expect to see scores here that would generally be above the cut point for an intellectual disability. I would assess a child for an intellectual disability with an IQ test, as well as assessments of adaptive behavior and so on. If I thought I suspected an intellectual disability, because the question I'm asking is, why isn't this child responding to instruction? Not just eligibility, but why isn't this child responding? And so I would do IQ and achievement, IQ and adaptive behavior. If I had a child with autism, because level of intellectual functioning is a very important determinant of the type of intervention that you would do with a child with autism, I would use an IQ test, but I would make a decision about what types of tests that I would use. If I had a concern about limited English proficiency, I would assess this. I would take into account economic disadvantage. I would absolutely do assessments for behavioral problems and comorbid disorders, because there are lots of kids with learning disabilities have anxiety, they have ADHD. Those need to be taken into account as part of the treatment plan, because your intervention plan will be much less effective if you don't take into account. So is there validity for methods that are based on RTI? And that's the question that involves comparing kids who are in this box and are not in this box. The answer is yes. These are cognitive profiles of kids that are based on assessments of instructional response after a tier 2 intervention. These are kids who did not meet decoding and fluency criteria. These are kids who did not meet fluency criteria. These are kids who did not meet, who responded to the intervention. And these are kids who did not meet, these are typical achievers. These are different measures of cognitive skills here. And you can see very clear, statistically significant differentiation in these profiles. The difference is that they are profiles that are based on severity. These kids just have more severe reading problems here. These are standard scores here. So you get a sense of how severe their cognitive problems are. They parallel almost exactly the severity of their reading problems. And if you're interested, the single skill that accounts for most of the variability is phonological awareness, which is also the skill that accounts for variability in whether you have dyslexia or not, or whether you're going to be successful in learning to read. This is the same group after a tier 3 intervention, where we have measures of vocabulary, nonverbal reasoning, phonological awareness, oral language. Don't get confused by the up and down direction of these profiles, but you see the same sort of statistically significant differentiation, where these are typical kids, these are adequate responders, these are tier 3 adequate responders, and these are tier 3 inadequate responders. These kids have very pervasive academic language deficits. Again, it's phonological awareness that accounts for the differences in these profiles, along with vocabulary. But the reason these are up and down is because of differences in the normative sample. These are brain imaging studies. This is a typical achiever. This kid responded to the intervention. This kid did not respond to the intervention. Again, I validated this classification with norm reference assessments. But if all I do is go in and assess instructional response, it's not reliable. That's because the attributes are dimensional. It's difficult to assess people in relation to a set cut point, but you can improve this if you use multiple criteria, like more than one assessment of instructional response, an assessment of instructional response with norm reference assessment, and if you think about confidence intervals, or setting the bar really high to reduce the number of kids who are at risk. How many resources should you devote to finding the right student? It's not test and treat, it's treat and test. Assess kids in relation to interventions. So identification issues are universal across methods. There are no qualitative markers of learning disabilities. We have measurement error, and I don't understand why we persist with rigid cut points. Instructional response is a continuum. There are no qualitative markers of inadequate responders. So specific issues in RTI are more than cut points and don't equate to the adequacy of the measurement of instructional response. And the big issue for the field is actually not what method do we use, although obviously I'm biased towards MTSS methods and RTI, but how does the field move to informed decision making using multiple criteria and stop relying on psychometric formula? IDEA says the team decides whether the child is eligible or not. So best practice is to use assessments that are reliable, well-normed, on the same sample and valid, to assess multiple domains and consider comorbidity, to assess in relation to treatment, to use confidence intervals, to use multiple criteria. It is a comprehensive data gathering process in the context of a triangle model, and to recognize that it's a team decision. Comprehensive evaluations are required no matter what method is employed. They can occur any time in the RTI process. The goal is not only special education eligibility, but to understand why the child has not responded to instruction. So these are the blocks. I don't have time to go through the rest of the PowerPoint. If my understanding is correct, right, I'm about out of time. But what I've done is I've given you assessment guidelines, such as the questions to ask: why isn't the child responding to instruction? I've given you guidelines for assessing response to instruction, for evaluating contextual factors, for establishing low achievement. And I draw your attention to this table, which talks about how to use norm reference tests to assess constructs that are most relevant. And this is what I do in my assessments. And I leave you with the question of who is learning disabled. Is it the student who does not respond to quality instruction? These are students who are hard to teach, not able to learn. It's low achievement and inadequate instructional response. So I appreciate your time. I am going to try and take some questions. There's my website, and we have a manual that we prepared for the Texas Education Agency that you can get with this link that talks about strengths and weaknesses in different assessment approaches. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fletcher. We just had one question, and I'll throw that out there to you. I know you touched on it a little bit in your presentation, but could you share your thoughts a little more deeply on the relation between the actual terminology of a reading learning disability versus dyslexia? Is it essentially a learning disability in basic reading skills? Do all students who have SLD in basic reading skills have dyslexia? Someone working in a district that uses RTI for SLD determination says many times those get meshed together, the terms. How critical is that?
It's very controversial. I do not know a way. The reason that I use the term word level reading disability is because it's very difficult to identify kids with dyslexia and differentiate them from other kids that have word level reading disabilities. And so I use the term dyslexia to refer to them all. I have colleagues who won't use the term dyslexia at all, but I think the best way to understand it is to understand it as a problem with foundational reading skills or basic reading skills. It has a lot to do with the quality of instruction. A lot of kids that emerge with word level problems simply haven't had an explicit phonics-based instructional program. And that's really the key, because the intervention is not different. It's the same intervention, no matter whether you call it dyslexia or not. And then I see there's a question in the chat.
Yeah, I'm just gonna throw one more. Now they're all coming in, and we're short for time. But often
I don't mind staying over.
Okay. Often the team asks, how long should interventions be implemented, and when should the child be considered for special education services? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think interventions can be implemented. You have to look at the data, and the data needs to determine how long interventions are done. As long as the child is making progress towards the goal line and using good progress monitoring data, and you can see evidence of progress that you can show to the parents, you should continue with the intervention. If you do two major instructional adjustments, switching programs and things of that sort, and the child is still not responding, that may be a signal that you need to consider special education eligibility, particularly if that's the only way to get the child a really intensive intervention, because that's what kids need at that point.
Thank you. Do you have any suggestions in using norm referenced assessments after this period of lost instruction?
Well, again, the norm reference assessments that I would use would be achievement tests. And if you look at the slide, I use the, I put up, I think you can use any one that you want, the Woodcock-Johnson 4, the Wyatt, or the KTEA. You can supplement that with other reading tests like text-based reading tests for reading comprehension problems and so on. But I think any of them will work. I use the KTA personally. That's not necessarily an endorsement. It's because I can score it by hand, and I want my students to learn how to score by hand, and I don't have to use computer programs or buy something from Pearson to score the KTEA. But I think all three are outstanding instruments, and I gave you an alignment in that slide that I didn't have time to go through.
Okay, I'm going to have us stop there. I know they have your information for email, so if more questions come up,
please email me. I'll respond to it, but you can find this information easily in the handbook that I talked about or in our book, but don't hesitate to email me.
And I do want to say just some of the questions coming in on the Schoology platform. You'll find his materials if you didn't get them beforehand in the folder for this session. And this is recorded, so you'll be able to have access to it. So I just want to thank you again, Dr. Fletcher, for your presentation, and for all the attendees today. We will have this session, since it's recorded, available on YouTube in the future. And the patent literacy team will also be creating supports aligned to these presentations at the symposium to maximize learning for families and educators.